Repaying Your Parents in Buddhist China. Our speaker today is Professor Lau Yue Chiang. Professor Lau Yue Chiang is Associate Professor of Chinese Studies at the National University of Singapore. He specializes in Chinese intellectual history and religions, covering Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and interactions from the classical period to late imperial times. Currently, he is completing two of his books on early medieval China. To chair today's session, we have with us Professor Patricia Oberoi. Professor Oberoi is Honorary Fellow and member of the Governing Council ICS. Welcome, sir. Welcome, ma'am. Before I hand over to the chair, I'd request everyone to take note of a few webinar ground rules. During the presentation, we request everyone to keep your audios on mute, except for the chair and the speaker. You can use the chat box to type in your questions and your comments during the presentation. And once the presentation is over, during the question and answer session, you can use the raise hand option and you can ask your questions or pose your comments. Kindly unmute only when your name is called upon. Now, I'd like to hand over the floor to the chair, Professor Oberoi. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Priksha. Well, I'd now like to formally welcome Professor Law and informally welcome YK, which is much easier than his name, and say how pleased we are to have you with us. As we were working up to this, and as perhaps some of you heard just now, Professor Law was a bit shy of coming here after looking at the ICS website. And he had gained the impression, not unjustified, that the major interest of ICS fellows and associates is and has been in, if I might say, the geopolitical aspects of China and contemporary international relations. However, I told him that we all fully believe in the importance of a cultural and civilizational perspective. And I'm sorry to say, as has been pointed out by several critics of China studies in India recently, that the expertise on Chinese history, ancient China, medieval China, and early modern China in India has not really grown exponentially over the last century. And one has the uncomfortable feeling that, in fact, there are very few boots on the ground. So if Professor Law can persuade any of the young people here that in order to understand modern and contemporary China, they need to have a perspective on Chinese culture, that would be a very welcome outcome. I might say that an increasing number are and have been skilled in Chinese language. And that, of course, is an excellent entree into ways of thought and ways of thinking. But it's certainly not enough. So it is really very, very welcome to have you here and speaking to a topic, and I will say more later on in summing up, in a topic which always invites new perspectives and recent perspectives and interdisciplinary perspectives. Perhaps at the end, if I get time, I will enlighten you as to the very fixed picture that many of us had as young sinologists in the 50s and late 50s and 1960s. And one will be saying what a long way this study has come since then. But the questions remain very important. We have in China, as in India, a plural religious system or plural ethical systems, multiple ethical systems. And the question is, what is their relationship? Is it to be understood in evolutionary terms that you had this, and then it gave way to that, and then this entered, and finally you have modernization, and then you have the reinvention and reinvention and reinvention of traditions? Or can one look at the questions in a very different way in terms of complementarities, of stratification, and so on? But let's hear what he has to say. He is, as you will have heard from his biodata, a man of many parts. He has covered all the main streams of Chinese philosophy and religion. I miss the feared legalists in his account, but I'm sure he will map them into the picture now. And we also note that his outreach to Chinese citizens in Singapore and around the world has been through explications of the rather mystical philosopher Zhuangzi. And I doubt if he really appears in today's talk, but this is a very important stream of thought which has always had an important role within China and for a Western audience of Orientalists, philosophers, mystics, and what have you. He was the man who wondered whether, am I right, Professor Law, in his dream, he was a man dreaming of a butterfly,
Yes.
or was he a butterfly dreaming of a man, that he was a man?
Yes.
So with that thought, we'll go on to your main topic, which has political meaning as well as deeper cultural roots and connections, of course, with India through Buddhism. So thank you very much. It's an honor to have you here. And we go ahead. About 30 minutes or so, and you have a slide presentation, which will make it easier for people to follow. Thank you very much for taking the trouble there.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor O'Brien, for your very kind introduction. First of all, I have to express my gratitude to ICS to invite me to give a talk today. I'm looking forward to your feedback and remarks and so on. This is, of course, a filial devotion or filial piety, as it's more commonly translated, is a very important concept and value in China since time immemorial. Of course, it's still important today, but we won't be getting into the modern period today. In fact, I will cover mainly from earliest time up to the 6th century or so. As a researcher, my typical approach is conceptual and intellectual historical. So although I have a paper ready for today's talk, I would like to share my thoughts in a different way than I wrote it. So let me start with the very idea of xiao. To understand the significance of xiao in Chinese culture, we need to know, first of all, right, what exactly it means or it meant when we talk about pre-modern China. Now in English, the word filial is not used very often, actually. We don't really hear the word at all.
Professor Law, I believe you had a slideshow to as well.
I did not really prepare the PPT, but when I come to the talk itself,
okay.
I will show some text.
Pardon my interruption.
Okay. I thought I prefer not to read from the script.
Absolutely.
Probably it's easier for the audience to follow me, but I will refer to the script in a moment. Anyway, I want to talk about the concept first, right? The very concept of xiao. Because I am not assuming any background knowledge from my audience, so I want to prep everybody to follow what I will say concerning the topic itself. But again, without a good knowledge of a good understanding of what xiao is, I think it's it may be difficult to follow me. So that's why I want you to talk about the concept first. Since I'm using English, so I need to also explain it in English first. As I said, right, xiao typically, usually is translated as filial piety, and I myself find it problematic. I'll explain in a moment. So filial piety, let's look at these two words in English. As I was saying, the word filial is not really used very often in English. I don't know when was the last time you heard it. It's not used very often, unless you're reading a Chinese paper on filial piety, right? Otherwise, you hardly really hear the word. In contrast, however, the word parental is heard every day, everywhere, right? Of course, the word is usually used in the context of parenting, and parenting is about agency, duty, responsibility, and accountability. This in itself seems to be suggestive enough. I mean, it certainly to draw a contrast between Chinese culture and Western culture, let's say, English speaking. So no doubt the emphasis on parenting, we're still talking about English culture, is an important issue in the West, not only in the ethical sense, but perhaps more importantly, in the business sense. I don't know if this is also true of India today, but that's not my concern here today. In any case, we should note that parenting is about parental agency. Now, when we talk about filial piety, right, for the sake of convenience, I'm using filial piety for now. So when we talk about filial piety, we are not really talking about parental agency. We are focusing on filial agency. This issue of agency is important. Now, according to Merriam-Webster online dictionary, filial means, right, relating to or befitting a son or daughter. So clearly, filial is a descriptive term. Filial piety then would mean piety befitting a son or a daughter. What does piety means? The dictionary defines it as fidelity to natural obligations as to parents. Now, as a value-laden term, this is too general and lack precision for the translation of xiao in Chinese. On the other hand, filial piety also means dutifulness in religion. In this sense, piety concerns religious beliefs, and it is exactly in this very sense that early missionaries in China and scholars with Christian background translate the Chinese term xiao as filial piety. So in other words, the translation of xiao as filial piety serendipitously brought in this Christian connotation, and it would affect how we would understand what filial piety is about if we are relying on, with the guidance of this English translation. And I think it created a lot of problem. In fact, that's why I'm trying to address this issue in my study. So we have to ask, for example, does filial piety have any religious connotation in modern Chinese society, for example? I'm talking about modern Chinese society. Of course, we could also ask the same question with regard to a pre-modern Chinese society. This is a very important issue to be investigated. And when we study pre-modern China in particular, in my case, this is equally important. But unfortunately, scholars basically ignore its significance. Now, when scholars talk about filial piety, they tend to emphasize xiao as a behavioral rules or norms, and all too often neglect its affective dimension. The affective dimension is very important. right? Filial feelings for parents are humane. It's a particular attribute of human beings. But when scholars study filial piety, they tend to ignore that while focusing on xiaos as behavioral rules or norms, as if xiao is void of any genuine affection sons and daughters naturally feel for their parents. As such, it is not uncommon to cast xiao in a negative light. And then some scholars would even go so far as to condemn Confucianism as the patriarchal ideology that promoted xiao as an inviolable virtue. So this is the general background I would like to provide before I get into the topic today, my paper today. Does xiao really have any religious connotations? Or was xiao merely a set of behavioral rules or norms demanded of the sons and daughters? What does that have to do with the parent-child relationship? As I suggested, filial piety has a very important dimension of human feelings, filial affection for parents, and I want to bring that out today in my talk. So, if you look at the topic of my talk today and or the abstract, you can see that I want to trace the evolution of xiao before Buddhism came to China in the 1st century, and how it would continue to develop and evolve under the influence of Buddhism until, in my talk today, until around the 6th, 7th century. So let me share my screen now. Let's see here. Okay. I want to draw attention to these few titles because I will refer to them in my talk. The first one is the Xiao Jing, classic of filial devotion. This is, of course, very important, as the titles already indicate. It's a very foundational text in China. It informed filial conduct since at least the 2nd century before the Common Era. The text itself probably was composed in the 3rd century before the Common Era. It was a Chinese text, native Chinese text. The other text is called the Analects, and the third one is mentioned. Both of these are Confucian classics. And then I will refer to the Sutra in 42 section. This is a text, a Buddhist text of Indic origin. I won't say anymore, but it wasn't native to China. And it was considered the earliest Buddhist scripture translated into Chinese by many scholars, although it could be debated. And then the next text is another Indic text, right? It's called Sutra on the Difficulty to Repay Parental Kindness, spoken by the Buddha. It was translated into Chinese in the 2nd century. And then 2 more. The titles looks very similar, right? The next one is Sutra on the Deep Kindness of the Parents. This was not an Indic text. It was what we consider a apocrypha. meaning it was written probably by someone in China, pretending it to be an Indic text translated into Chinese, but in fact it was written in Chinese. The next one, same thing, a sutra about the difficulty of requiting the deep kindness of parents. This is another apocryphal scripture. So these two were written by Chinese writers in Chinese. They were imitating this Indic text, right, pretending that they also came from India. So I will be referring to these texts. Okay, let me start. I have a set of scripts here. Maybe I'll talk about that before I go on. Chronologically, we run from my left, right from here, to the right. This is the same graph for the term xiao, right? Filial piety. This is what we're still using in modern Chinese script. So if you go backwards, this is the earliest. The first one came from a piece of oracle bone inscription. This would date back to about 3000 BCE. Now this graph depicts an elderly person standing upright. Right? This is the long hair. This is the person, human figure. The next one came from, this is from the Shang dynasty. The next one will come from the Zhou dynasty, succeeding it. And then you can see the difference. The difference here would become a young child carrying an elderly figure on his shoulders, perhaps, or on his back. So here we have a different composition of the graph. The rest will follow this one until, I mean, even in the modern script, right? You have the young person here. This is the elderly figure that we could not really see so well now. But for those of you who know Chinese, you can tell the top part here is an abbreviated form of another graph that means elderly or old. So it represents an elderly person on the back of a young person. So this suggests that this elderly person is no longer independent. He or she would need physical support, literally. And this is how early Chinese want to portray or connote that sense of relationship between child and parent and child. So we can see some, according to this graphic representation, you can see that the evolution of this concept of xiao already. From an independent elderly person standing on his or her own to one that require physical support, that focus more on that relationship between parent and child. So that's the background. And okay. As I said, I would not be reading from the script, and because of the time, I won't be able to finish reading anyway. But what I wanted to say just for now is that xiao in Chinese was not purely descriptive. Actually, it's primarily prescriptive. So using the word filial in English to translate it would really miss the point. Filial only indicates that objective relationship between parent and child. It has nothing to about what should be happening between them. Whereas xiao in Chinese pinpoint exactly on that. But how is that relationship should be negotiated? As I suggested earlier, change over time. Therefore, the concept of xiao evolve over time. And with the introduction of Buddhism into China, its evolution will become more complex. That's the basic story frame. Okay. So when we study pre-modern China, we need to be sensitive to the nuances of these basic terminologies, because they carry very different denotation and connotations. Although there's continuity into the modern days, but the continuity is fluid. It wasn't rigid. So for me anyway, I want to examine this complexity in this process. So if we want to study it, express it, articulate it in modern English, that would be another barrier to overcome because of the differences between Chinese language and English. That's why I find this indiscriminate translation of xiao into English as filial piety problematic, and with the wrong context, it could be just wrong. The key idea here is, the key elements here is whether filial xiao did have religious connotations with regard to the time we are talking about. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. So if you use filial piety indiscriminately to refer to xiao, you're bound to run into problems. So in my paper, I actually started with a section on that. I call it loss in translation. But here I won't go into further details now. So let's see. I'll move on. I have a section on this, but I won't go into that now. Filial piety or filial devotion actually is all about practices. It's not just a mere concept. So when you talk about practices, what kind of practices would be considered filial or would be considered xiao? To more accurately, which I should say xiao, varies over time. Okay, in this section, I used the example of xiaoshun, right? This is what we would call in modern Chinese. If we say a child is xiaoshun, that means this person is filial, right? Is filial pious. But this term was actually very old, and it first appeared in the 6th century BCE text, where actually it meant something different. Xiaoshun today would connote the sense of obedience, but in this early text, it did not really mean that. It would mean something more about the sense of constraint. You have to constrain yourself so that you won't be offending. The sense of constraint is much stronger than a strict obedience of norms. So here I want to show how the same term actually changed over time. So anyway, I'll skip this part now. I focus on the earliest understanding of Xiao. As I show with the graphs, right, the earliest genetic graph for Xiao, it dated back as far as we know today with concrete evidence from a piece of oracle bone inscription over 3,000 years ago. And it depicts an elderly person in a properly standing posture. Unfortunately, there's a long piece of evidence. We don't know exactly how it was used, other than the sense of place name or person's name. With more this archaeological discovery coming, maybe we will be able to be more certain about how this graph was actually used. But later in the Zhou dynasty, as I said, right, we see that the graph has changed and the meaning changed with regard to parent-child relationship. We could say that the physical care provided to the parents were considered natural obligation of the children. But other than that, I think the most important point here during the Zhou dynasty is that we have another graph called xiang, which literally means to make sacrificial offerings to one's deceased parents, not living parents. So xiang clearly was a religious ritual. And the construction of the graph itself, I'm not going to analyze it, the structure of the graph, but the construction of the graph indicates that it was performed, this sacrificial offering was performed in an ancestral shrine of some kind. So as such, Xiao clearly involves religious dedication and devoutness. So Xiao, at this point of time, did have religious connotation. If we translate the Xiao in this context as filial piety, that's fine. I think that's perfectly acceptable. So while filial care for living parents, right, was clear, but now Xiao would acquire new dimension, right, referring to sacrificial offerings paid to deceased parents. This evolution is important because when you pay sacrifices to a deceased parents, if this service, if you will, would not be of any utilitarian purpose. So this is about non-utilitarian referential feelings of religiosity, and the surviving children's perception of what parents would mean. That perception also changed with this introduction of xiang being associated with xiao. So this, as I said earlier, right, xiao was not all about behavioral rules or norms. It also involved the children's, the offspring's genuine affection for their parents, in this case, for the departed parents. As we will see later, this genuine affection would be highlighted for filial feelings for living parents. This we did not really find in the textual or material evidence prior to this point of time. This notion of religiosity embedded in xiao, we find an echo in 1,000 years later, when we finally come to have the text, the classic of filial devotion that I mentioned earlier, right? That the standard text on this virtue, this filial virtue, xiao. Because in that text, we would have a chapter that explicitly talk about elevating deceased parents' status to the level of heaven. In other words, deceased parents were compared to the grandeur of heaven in a sacrificial setting. Although this sacrifice was only performed by the Son of Heavens, the emperor, it was his privilege. Other than the emperor himself, nobody else could actually do it. So at this point of time, when in the 3rd century before the Common Era, we have this inherited sense of religiosity from earlier times, but now it was restricted to the emperor. For everybody else, the basic idea of virtue, of filial piety, is outlined in the very first chapter of the Xiao Jing. And I highlighted in yellow here. This is what it says. Your physical person, right, with his hair and skin, received from your parents. Vigilance is not in allowing anything to do injury to a person where Xiao begins, and so on and so forth. So it's taking care of yourself, your physical self, you won't do any harm to it, and then make a name for yourself to bring glory to your family. This is everybody's obligation as long as you are a male, in this case. But this change, this egalitarian notion of xiao would change over time. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. When we come to Buddhist China, where sons and daughters would be able to perform sacrifices for their deceased parents and living ones as well. In that case, so gender would not be an issue. You could see the change here. Okay, I'll skip this part about the filial, the Xiao Jing. But during the 2nd century BCE, when the Han Dynasty came to be, filial piety would be translated into political loyalty to the emperor or to their government superiors. This translation was not done. You would not find it in Buddhist China within the Buddhist realm. That part did not change. Okay. Now, how much time do I have?
If you could, would that be enough to wind up? We need to get onto the Buddhist.
Yeah, I'm going to get into that,
yeah.
but I want to double check with you the time.
Yeah.
10 more minutes?
Yeah. Yes, at least 10 more.
Okay. Now, to get into the Buddhist part, I think that, as I said earlier a couple of times, the crux of the issue is genuine affection. That part was critical. If you look at the Analects, if you look at the Mencius, you will see that it's the critical element of filial virtue. In that connection, you will not see the parent-child relationship understood as a transactional relationship. So parent and child do not engage in a transaction that requires the child to pay back what they received from their parents, including their birth. You find that missing in all pre-Buddhist Chinese literature with regard to filial virtue. Yes, a lot of writing on the behavioral rules and norms and all that, but the idea of transaction was absent. The behavior was described to be driven by genuine affections, genuine motivation of love. When Buddhism came, this changed. When you look at all these Buddhist texts, including those three titles I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, you will see that, for example, this is the sutra in the 42nd section. It says it's better to have one's parents or the teaching of the honored ones in this lifetime than to feed 10 billion solitary Buddha. It's better to feed one Buddha. I aspiring to be a Buddha and save all sentient beings than to educate 100 billion parents. So the Buddha was above the parents, but beyond that, by excluding the Buddha, parents were considered most important. So therefore, it says it's better to filial to one's parents than to serve heaven and earth, and so on and so forth. Parents are the most miraculous. So how are we going to deal with these miraculous people, miraculous parents? The scripture would go on to tell you. So this is the Indic scripture, translated in the 2nd century, and it says, right? See, first of all, it has this line, right? Even if the child carry his father on his right shoulder, his mother on his left shoulder for 1,000 years, and let them defecate on him without resentment, it's still not sufficient for him to requite their kindness. And how can you repay? So if your parents do not have faith in Buddhism, help them to cultivate so that they can attain peace and calm and so on. So educate your parents, make them observe Buddhist teaching and so on. That's the only way to repay their great kindness to you, to repay your debt to them. This is a consistent refrain in all these Buddhist scriptures on filial piety. And this is the idea, as I said, that was missing before Buddhism came. In the two invitation, right? So in this kind of understanding, parent-child relationship was considered transactional. Filiality was transactional. The child is always under the obligation to pay back, since the greatness, the great kindness of the parents was consistently emphasized and portrayed in various ways. And in various ways, we find them in the Chinese invitation scripture, the Apocrypha. This is the first one, scripture on the deep kindness of parents. We can see this here, right? If we try to measure the kindness of his mother, it is as boundless as heaven. How can we repay the kind mother? Now here, the last bit actually was a quote from Confucian classics, the Odes. So the author of this text was borrowing a classical Confucian concept and translated into Buddhist language here. But this is still not enough. We have another one later to further elaborate the suffering of the mother during childbirth, to exaggerate how much the child would owe the parents, particularly the mother. How are you going to repay it? In this one, in this scripture, this first apocrypha, we have this passage from the text, right? Any sentient being who can cultivate merits for their parents by copying this scripture, this fixed scripture, burning incense and paying homage to the Buddha, making offering to the three jewels, and feeding the Sangha, this person, rest assured, can requite the kindness of his parents. So instead of instructing the parents on Buddhist teaching, as the index scripture said, the offspring now could requite their boundless kindness by transferring salvific merits to their parents and spreading it to the wider public, and by performing religious rituals. Right? Remember, performing rituals, this can be done by anyone now, right? As opposed to the privilege of the Son of Heaven earlier. So instead of the message in the index scripture, right, where parents still need to follow and observe Buddha's teaching, right, they still need to practice it in order to attain liberation. But with the apocryphal teaching, parents now can enjoy the payback without any Buddhist practice, right, without even embracing Buddhism themselves. Because the transaction nature of filial piety make the children pay. The parents did not need to do anything. The agency falls totally on the parents, on the children. So this religious dimension of filial piety, as I said, right, earlier it was preserved for the emperor only, right, strict for everybody else. Now it was brought back with the apocrypha, Buddhist apocrypha, but of course for an entirely different purpose. Now this is the biggest change, I think, in this evolution, is the nature, the transactional nature of filial practices that was new to the Chinese, and that make it available, make it totally egalitarian to the population, where everybody can join in. I think I'll stop here, but I welcome questions so that maybe I can elaborate more.
Well,
thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, YK. I noted that in your biodata it had been said you're interested in making classical Chinese philosophy and culture accessible to the general public. I think
that's my aspiration.
I think you've done that in full measure, though we only got up to about the 6th century AD, and we're waiting for a bit more action. So at the moment, I see some comments in the chat box. And I note also that Poonam Suri, one of our adjunct fellows, who has worked on Chinese religion quite extensively and religions in China, has just joined the meeting. Poonam, if you're there still, could you unmute yourself? I'm sure you have some comment on the presentation or where you'd like to go to.
Professor Suri?
Yes, please go ahead, Poonam. Poonam, I think while you're trying to come in, which I'm sure you are, I note that Shriram Natarajan has a question. Would you like to go ahead and ask Shriram? Well, okay then. Yes.
Could the IT team help Professor Poonam Suri to unmute? She's saying she's not being able to unmute herself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, well, that was a very, very interesting talk, and it's completely up my alley. This is exactly what I have been, trying to explore and do some research in. And in my books that I've written, it's all about Buddhism, Confucianism, and filial piety was something which I really felt was, very important, and it kind of overlapped, between the two. And for me, Confucian piety was a very Confucian aspect, but I think you've made it very interesting by, giving it that the Buddhist, explanation to it. So I know there are sutras where parents and children are, there are some duties towards each other, especially the children towards the parents. And I, in fact, I also wanted to explore Taoism and bring it into this whole, concept. But I think your talk was really very interesting. And what I feel is that in a way, Buddhism was about celibacy. But if you look at the broader concept, you cannot have bodhisattvas until you have more people coming into the world. So celibacy is one part of it, but the other part is to have, the enlightenment of the Buddha, the nirvana, and how would we change the world if there were no more bodhisattvas? So to bring children into the world was also a very important thing. And this whole concept of filial piety brings it all together. So a lot more we can discuss, we can go on and on discussing this, but I think I'll give other people a chance to ask questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Poonam. Would you like to respond to that, Professor Low?
Well, I suppose it's not really a question, but
Yeah, observation.
It's an interesting remark. Of course, the existence of human beings, right, is the prerequisite for everything.
Absolutely.
Not only for Buddhism, as for just for everything, whether it's a religion or a philosophy. Without human beings, well, there's nothing to really talk about.
Absolutely.
Right? That's a fundamental common sense, I suppose. But of course, within this given, how we are going to become a worthy human being, let's say, right? This big how differs or varies from one doctrine to another. Buddhism, of course, is one of the many here. So in the context of filial piety, how a Chinese person would consider himself or herself to be such a filial exemplar would be different over time. That's the idea. And even with Buddhism, I think it also evolved. That's why this is a very complex, complicated topic, because as you know, in the history of Buddhism, the doctrine also changed over time from early Buddhism to later Mahayana and so on and so forth. Right? When it really dribbled down to China, we have the so-called Chan Buddhism, or better known as Zen in English. So filial piety, along with the development of Buddhism itself, also changed. It's very complicated. Today, I try to talk about the cross-fossilization between native Chinese culture and some of the Buddhist doctrine only.
Yes.
Okay. I did a disservice to Shri Ram Natarajan. He actually had a message in the chat box, namely the question that is the concept of xiao, filial piety, extended to other elders, such as teachers, as we find it in India, respect for parents, respect for other elders and teachers. Quick answer, I'm sure, to that one.
This is an excellent question. The translator for this 2nd century Indic text that I refer to in my talk also translated another Indic text that talks about family virtue, where the children in the family would respect their parents and their teacher in the same way. So in that sense, if we borrow the Chinese term filial piety to apply to them, then yes, according to that Indian Buddhist scripture, filial piety apply to both parents and teachers. But again, as I said earlier today, translation is a tricky business. Respect and filial piety are not the same thing, at least to the Chinese. They are not the same thing. For the Chinese, for teacher, the term would be respect. For the parents, the term would be xiao. They are not the same. So,
and can they both be linked to shun for obedience?
Although we would treat our teacher as if they were our parents, but the term for it, the term for that feelings for it, is not xiao. That's really the crux, and that's what I want to differentiate in my study. I mean, when we just have a chit chat, that's fine. We can be liberal about our language, but if you really want to get into the historical reality, I think we need to differentiate them.
Well, I think that people tuning in from India might have something to reflect there, because there are rituals. You often spoke of the ritual and the worshipful and the religious aspect. There are occasions when people's respect for teachers are shown in a ritual idiom, as you might to a parent, though in a lesser way. So that's something that could be explored by people interested in that question. Now, Swapna Bhattacharjee had a question about, Swapna, if you're there, could you unmute yourself and ask what you meant by referring here to the bhakti concept in India and Southeast Asia, and why that came to your mind? Swapna, are you there?
Professor Uberoi, so we have around 7 questions in the chat box. So maybe we could take a few. Yeah, maybe we could take a couple of bunch, and then maybe the speaker could address them.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Well, that was one from Swapna, but we would need her to explain. So let me see. There was one question from Usha Chandran, thanking you for the interesting talk, but asking how and why the concept of xiao started being seen in a very negative light.
Yes. Are we okay now? Connection?
Yeah, I think so. Swapna Bhattacharya, also, you come in, Swapna, but just unmute you. You need to unmute yourself, please. Can you unmute yourself, Swapna?
Hello?
Yes, come in now.
Yeah. Nice to see you and all. I have totally enjoyed the speech. I was just thinking about the cult of bhakti, devotion, which is very widely practiced in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, Indonesia, in India, and it has a very old root, which I was just thinking. This parallel came to my mind, and of course, I am very happy to be with all of you. And I would like to request respected audience and the speaker, perhaps to read my recent most book on Rabindranath Tagore and Myanmar and Southeast Asia as a whole, in which I have tried to put all my writings on Buddhism, in which I have shown also my own indebtedness to great scholars who worked on China. And I think that Professor Ubera, you are right. We should get back to old, as an alumnus of Vishwabharati also, I was thinking of P.C. Bhakti's works and many works. And I have always tried to focus, Tagore or other scholars also, between the Indic and the Cynic. And I am happy to see that my works are constantly being referred in Singapore, especially in the university where he is teaching. And I have very nice memories, and my contact with Singapore scholar is still very much, very enjoyable. And thank you once again. I was just thinking whether young scholars can take up a bhakti cult and its parallel in China and various other countries in Southeast Asia, India, of course. So that will be something in which we can, sort of take up, comparative works on such traditions, which was widely spread across China, India, and Southeast Asia. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Swapnaji. That's a reminder to everyone. Now, time is getting short, so I would like to read out to Professor Law, if he hasn't seen them, some of the other questions. You can answer them as you like.
Well, you refer to one. Let me address the one from Usha, right?
Usha Chandran, yes, go ahead. How did it come to be negative?
Right.
I assume she was thinking about late 19th, early 20th century and thereafter.
Right. I think, well, first of all, in native China, as far as I know, we don't really have any literature that cast filial piety in a negative light, because it was a virtue promoted by the locals, communities, and also by the government. It was a general consensus. Nobody really questioned it. I mean, as an idea, as a virtue in itself. Again, I think I make it very clear in my talk, it's all about practice. The practices really matter because they were actually performed on the ground. We are not talking about ideas on paper. Now, this negative light, I would think, primarily came from Western influence, where the idea of human freedom, human agency, equality, and all these, democracy. When you examine filial piety in such light, in terms of practices, filial children were often perceived as subservient subject to their parents or their superiors. In that sense, they were made to conform to all sorts of behavioral rules and norms. So in that sense, it's not good, because the children themselves were not given this autonomy on their own. I think in that sense, filial piety was considered adversely. I think that's really the main reason. If you look at native literature, you don't really see that.
Well, I think the last sentence is quite important, that you are saying, and I would always, think of that critically, because every orthodoxy has a critique somewhere within a culture. But nonetheless, you were saying that this is a sort of late 19th or post-missionary, post-Christian, post-Westernization critique. But,
yeah, that becomes a discourse in itself.
Right.
Of course, I'm not saying that all children in China were happy with their parents. I didn't say that.
Okay. Look, there are many more questions and very little time. So let me read out 2 or 3 of them and then call Professor Anand Kumar Giri and one other. One from one to you from Law Pai Ling, saying, Professor Law, what's your opinion? Does Buddhism enhance filial piety and promote better family relations?
Definitely, definitely, no question about it. They are not, actually, they are not diametrical to each other. They don't, I mean, as far as filial piety is concerned, they complement each other.
I think that was your main argument, in a way, that Buddhism introducing a moral dimension with reference to the self or the child,
right?
The proper behavior actually enhances the post-mortal future of their parents. Now, a very interesting question from Beam Suba. Thank you, Professor Law. Is filial piety as sacrosanct in non-monogamous societies as it is in China?
I suppose that we're talking about contemporary times.
What's traditional China non-monogamous? Yes. Beam, are you there? Can you explain yourself at all? Quickly.
I imagine probably it refers to the fact that a man often would have multiple wives. I suppose that's what it meant.
Yeah.
That institution itself does not or did not contradict the value of filial piety, because there were, well, first of all, there was a culture about managing families. In traditional times, if you have a big family, usually they would have their set of their family clan rules, where every member of the clan, this extended family, would follow. So everybody would be living with that clan culture, and which was not inconsistent with this promotion of filial piety. Right. So we got to your elders, right? your parents in particular, there are still rules that govern your behavior.
Right.
In that sense, filial piety is still sacrosanct.
Right. I think that is a discussion which could go much further, because you might be looking at the difference between mothers and the father's concubines and other secondary wives. But now, quickly from hardly any time, Professor Virendra Sai, Colonel Verma, noting that we remember a picture carrying old blind parents by a son to ford religious destinations across India. Is that something, I suppose he's asking, is that something you could think of that the Chinese might regard as an act of great filial piety, carrying the parents on your shoulders to a religious pilgrimages?
Well, first of all, that carrying itself is considered a filial obligation.
Okay.
Right? There must be a reason why the child felt necessary to carry the blind parents around. There must be a reason.
Yeah.
Right? A reason that he certainly accepted. And not only that, but he actually carried it out. So I don't know the point, but certainly that behavior itself would be considered a filial virtue.
Well, we could consider it as a possible transcultural idiom for filial piety.
Well, this is like seeking help anywhere possible, right? Beyond China, even. So I don't see why this is odd. This is very natural to me.
Yeah, right.
Destination is not the point. It's the dedication to help your parents.
Okay, now there's one interesting question here from Rohit Singh saying, Professor Law, could you please discuss the responses received by Buddhism, or by pious Buddhists, I suppose, after the incorporation of the principles of filial piety in their texts? I think what he may be getting at is that the drift of your argument is what happened to the Confucian, let's say, notion of filial piety after it was conjoined or enriched by Buddhism. But for pious Buddhists, would there be a response, a reaction? Is this, is there something to be said in the other direction? I may be misinterpreting comments. Yeah.
Well, because as you know, Buddhism practices celibacy. Celibacy. So if you decided to follow the Buddhist life, you to become a monk or a nun later, you have to leave the household life. For the male, that means you would, if you did not have any children before you left the household life, that means you would really cut off the bloodline of the family. That would be considered very unfilial. So that's really the bone of contention here. Celibacy and the
procreation,
continual of this family line.
Yeah.
That's really the bone of contention. And for the Buddhists, they have to address this problem by saying that leaving the household life actually is not unfilial. It is a provisional step of being filial. How can that be filial ultimately? It's filial because when the child who left the family would become enlightened, he would be able to deliver the entire family. In that sense, it's a greater virtue than ordinary filial piety. And not only that, because as an enlightened person, this son could actually bring enlightenment to everybody, not
Yes.
only their parents.
Yes.
So in that sense, it generates greater merits. Therefore, it's a greater kind of filial piety.
Right.
That's the essential argument that the Buddhists, including the Chinese Buddhists, right, who follow the doctrine, have to provide in addressing this really point of contention.
Well,
How can they justify leaving the household life?
thank you very much for that explanation. And I think there will be a lot of things that would follow on from that. Now, Professor Giri, would you like to ask at least one of your questions at this point? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Uberoi. Thank you, Professor Lowe. Now, beginning with this possible movement towards a cross-civilizational understanding that was suggested by Professor Uberoi, for example, understanding death, filial piety as part of death, how are we enriched by engaging with Indic concepts like Rina and Dana, gift. My second quick query is that you refer to practice, and the whole dynamics of practice brings the question of agency, both in an autonomous and connected sense. So to understand this text, whether you also have looked at portrait of practice in literature, in novels and poetry. And my third quick query is that as you are interested in contemporaneizing Chinese philosophy, how do we read this text with a dialogue with the contemporary? It is in that sense, what might be a possible dialogue between filial piety and intergenerational solidarity, or friction for that matter.
Okay, I'm not sure if I heard everything very clearly, but the first question seemed to be about Dana, you said, right? About
Rina
what?
is debt. You know, in the concept, the idea of the rin means Rina and Dana, the debt, indebtedness and gift.
Yeah. So it's about gratitude and gift. So are you asking me about the Buddhist notion of gratitude and debt? I mean, gift. How were they received in China? Is that right?
No, my question is that to understand the idea of debt, you know, that we have to engage with the Indic and Chinese, you know, conceptual dialogue. And for example, as Buddhism also draws from Indic sources, the idea of the Rina, you know, that and Dana. And Dana is not just gift, you know, the whole idea of the Dana and as categories, you know, I'm pleading for the possibilities of dialogue among categories to understand the themes that we witnessed in the Buddhist text.
If I might come in here, I think that is a very important thought, but I think it's a conversation that needs to be carried on by exchange of emails between two people and coming. This is a very important, you know, because we haven't really had the Indic Buddhist concepts brought out in their fullness. We have had a lot of Xiao being merged with the Indic, but not the Indic in conversation with Xiao. So one final question, may I ask Rija, please, to come in and ask a question which is waiting in the background, in the backdrop. Rija, are you there? Can you ask your question, please?
Hello. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Professor Low. I
Yes.
just had a query regarding the concept of Shao being how egalitarian.
Right.
As in, was there any challenge to the concept of Shao from any social classes across the social hierarchy?
As a concept, it is egalitarian.
Yes.
As I said, right, it's really all about practices. How do you express your filial obligations or affection to your parents may vary from person to person. For example, if you happen to be a Buddhist convert in China, the way you express that affection for your parents might be different from someone who was not a convert. So the actual behavior might be different. But within the larger context of Chinese culture at the time, they were both considered filial, children. So in that sense, it is egalitarian. I am not sure if I'm making sense. And that has nothing to do with social stratification. So the children of a poor family, let's say, may treat their parents in a way that would be different from another child from a aristocratic family, let's say. The way they're treating their parents would be different, but they were both considered filial within their culture.
Okay, I think in her written chat, Rija also asked, has the concept never faced any challenges during medieval China as it faces today? A quick answer to that. I think you have said really it was generally accepted until, if you like, contact with the West. But would you like to elaborate? Are there counter streams? Are there other dissonant voices?
I don't know what the situation you're referring to contemporary China, but in terms of the egalitarianism, as I was saying earlier, how you practice would be different, but the practices themselves would not be challenged.
Right.
As long as they were considered proper expressions.
Well, I think that we are now obliged to wind up. We've run a little over time. And as the chair here, I would like to say that I think all of us have learned a lot from this. It's a presentation absolutely bristling with possibilities for comparative study. We see concepts there with which we are familiar, and I'd like to give a word to one of them, the principle of vicariousness, that a person who lives a pious life and performs rituals correctly or whatever other desiderata and helps the soul of the departed soul of the parent achieve liberation. That person is also liberating the parent and also liberating mankind, if you like. So the principle of vicariousness within Buddhism is perhaps an extraordinary innovation as far as Chinese thought is concerned. At the same time, we note that Confucianism didn't always welcome the engagement with Buddhism or Confucian authorities or imperial authorities. The whole principle of disloyalty to the parents by not marrying, by seeking to be single, not reproducing children, was always part of the critique of Buddhism and its diminished and imperial pogroms, actually, against Buddhist practice. And finally, I think that I would place on record a plea, which Swapna Bhattacharya slightly referred to, that we need to return sometimes to those Indian scholars who were following what we call the Indo-Tibetan Sanskritic dialogue or Orientalist dialogue, and look again at their works. People like Binoy Kumar Sarkar, P.C. Bagchi, and so on, particularly in the early 20th century, who from a standpoint in India, rather than in Western Orientalism, which of course was looking at the plurality and interaction of Chinese religions all the time, we need to return to what Indian thinkers were thinking and making of it from a standpoint within this tradition here. And I think those are very important perspectives which get eliminated when we are, we are looking at, if you like, the Orientalist interpretations of Chinese religion and the differences between Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, their evolution, and so on. Thank you very much, Professor Law. I hope that we'll be in a longer term dialogue with you and your institution, your cultural center. And on behalf of all of us, thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you very much again for inviting me to share my thoughts with you. And I learned a lot from the questions. Very thought-provoking.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Lau, for sharing your study with us and addressing our many questions. It was a pleasure to hear you talk. I'd also like to thank Professor Oberoi for chairing this session. And lastly, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We'll close the session.